Hey everyone, it's Samuel, and welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Today in the Prime Material, Consequences, Not Punishment. In the Wilds, the Carrion Crawler. And in the Tavern, what would you do if a creature needed something strange? Well, how's it going today, everyone? I hope everybody out there is having an excellent day. Excited to dive into a discussion which seems subtle, and in fairness, it is, but dealing in consequences and not punishment as DMs or GMs in our tabletop role-playing games is important for our relationship with our players and for our storytelling. So I'm excited to dive into that concept today. Before we get into the Prime Material, though, some announcements to get out of the way. As you probably know, our next release on the DM's Guild, Disaster Hamsters, went live last Sunday, so almost a week ago now. Please check it out and give it a review. The document is still changing a little bit. There's a couple of things that we're going to add. We're going to add a art pack, which will contain all of the art for people using virtual tabletops to be able to actually port things over much easier. And with the way that the DM's Guild works, anytime that any of the files are updated, you will be able to get access to those files if you've purchased the supplement. So whenever we do make those improvements, you will have access to them as well. But it's going great so far. Thank you all very much for your support. Please keep sharing it. We're so excited for how people are enjoying it, and we can't wait for the stories to start rolling in about the games that people are playing with it. As far as the other announcements are concerned, remember to follow us on all our social media. You can find us at Plot Hooks on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Be sure to rate and review the podcast wherever you happen to be listening to it. It helps the podcast get out to more and more people. And we would also love your support on Patreon. If what we do here has meant a lot to you, we would genuinely appreciate your support there. And of course, you could also support the show financially by purchasing Disaster Hamsters on the DM's Guild. Your support keeps all the content rolling, and it helps us improve Plot Hooks each and every day. Thank you all so much for being part of the Plot Hooks family. But, without any further ado, let's dive into the Prime Material. Consequences, not punishment. Those two words, consequences and punishments, are one of the sets of words that are always linked in my mind. It might just be the use of those words generally in the southeastern U.S. where I grew up. I'm not sure how ubiquitous the specific use of those words is, but as far as my upbringing, I always subconsciously connected the words. When I was a kid, if I did something that I was expressly not supposed to, there would be consequences for it. And even though it was not often referred to with this term by those around me, I considered those consequences to be my punishment. And so even though that term wasn't used as much, those words just became linked in my head. But those words are different. Technically, those consequences were my punishment, but those words can't be linked just because it applies in that case. They're different words, and even though those two things are connected in that sense, they have very different definitions. Punishment is defined as the imposition of a penalty as a retribution for an offense. It's always in the negative. Someone does something that someone else deems wrong, and that someone else wants retribution. That's what punishment is. Consequences, on the other hand, are defined as simply the result or effect of an action or condition. It's not implicitly a negative. It is negative, positive, or neutral. It's just something that happens because you did something else. It's just a result. It's not a retribution. You do great at work, and you get a raise. That, by definition, is a consequence. You did something great, and you got, in that case, a reward, a positive consequence. But the word punishment has no such distinction, has no such analogy. It's always negative, and it's always retribution. And understanding the difference between these two words is important just in life, especially whenever you're in the position of authority over someone else. And because of this, it's also important in TTRPGs, because dungeon masters or game masters or whatever it's called in your particular system, we've got a lot of power over our games. We're the ones who set the scenarios, who steward the story, who set the encounters. We're the ones in control. We talk a lot here on Plot Hooks that the DM is not the storyteller, they're the steward of the story, and that's the ideal situation. That's the role that DMs should be, in my opinion. But that doesn't mean we don't have the power to overstep those bounds, because we absolutely do. The whole joke of rocks fall, everyone dies is a real thing. You can do that if you really want to lose a group of friends. If we want, we can just plop a Tarrasque in front of our level 1 party and call it a day. We have the power to do just about anything, even things which would be to the detriment of our group. And we as DMs also have the ability to respond to the actions of the PCs. And we should. If they kill a king, so to speak, there will be effects that result from that. Otherwise, it's not really going to be an effective story. It's not realistic. The actions of the PCs should result in our responding to it. But here's the thing. This has to be handled correctly. The response has to be handled correctly because we have the power to overstep the bounds. This is where the consequences versus punishment discussion comes in. We have to make sure that there are consequences to what the PCs do, not punishment for what the PCs do. We have to make sure that the actions that they took result in a suitable reaction in the story, a consequence. But we can't punish them for their actions. Now, I'd love to give some detailed tips on exactly what to do and what not to do, and we'll get into some general things to think about in a little bit. But the exact solution is going to vary by group, because it has a lot to do with making sure that your players don't feel like they're being punished. It doesn't matter if you as the DM think you're just giving consequences. If your whole group feels like you're punishing them, then that's going to be detrimental to your group. And ultimately, that's what it comes back to, right? It's about damaging real relationships and friend groups. You know, everything that we do here at the Plot Hooks Creative Network is centered on storytelling. It's all about us learning together to tell the best collaborative stories that we can. And if the players feel that the Dungeon Master is punishing them, that inhibits storytelling. Not only will it disengage the players, it will disenfranchise them from the story. It will cause them to roleplay perhaps even more cautiously in the future and be afraid to engage in your future plot hooks because they're not quite sure if they're going to get another punishment. And ultimately, it just damages those real relationships and friend groups. So we have to make sure that our responses to the player character's actions are clearly understood as consequences and not punishments. And again, there's going to be some variations between groups on where the line is drawn and how best to do this. I don't think I can really give very accurate descriptions of, okay, if you do this in a scenario, that's a punishment, but if you do this in a scenario, that's a consequence. I don't think I can really do that very well because I think the line is drawn differently in each group. Obviously, there's some things which, are totally beyond the pale and would easily be seen as punishment. If somebody does something that the DM doesn't like and the DM refuses to do a real world thing like pay for the snacks that they promised to pay for, then, that's just beyond the pale. We're not even thinking about something like that necessarily. But in terms of in-game things, the differences between consequences and punishments are going to be different for each group depending on the real-life relationship between the people, depending on the amount of time that each group has played together and the trust that has been developed between the players and the DM. It just varies. So I'm not going to give, again, any specific examples or things to do, so to speak. I just want to give you 4 things to think about. I'm not even going to call them tips, because again, just how you handle each situation may be different for your group. But these are things to think about when it comes to trying to make sure that there is real consequences to the actions that the players do, but not punishments. Making them feel like they have a real impact in the world, making their actions matter, having those consequences, but not making them feel punished for what they do. So the first thing to think about, I think, is just be open with your players. The more and more I continue on this show, the more and more I like the idea of a session 0, or even if there isn't like an actual session, so to speak, just open communication before the start of the game. We should be open with our players that this game is going to have consequences. If the players do something, good or bad, it will change the future course of events. Letting them know that this is not a railroad that they're going to be on no matter what happens. And this may seem obvious, especially to those who are used to playing this way. But it's important to communicate this just in case, because not everyone plays Dungeons & Dragons that way. And of course, if you're coming from other role-playing games, especially things like video games, there aren't many consequences that you have. If you're playing a video game, even something where your decisions do have some effect, like Skyrim or Mass Effect, you're kind of disconnected from the consequences of your actions more, at least to me. Sure, your decisions have ramifications, but you feel disconnected from it. And in the case of RPGs like Skyrim, there really is a lot fewer ramifications than I think you'd have in real life. You can kill a guard in a town, and then you go to jail, you pay a fine, and sleep for a little bit, and you're out of that situation in 5 minutes, and you could just forget about it and move on with your play. There's no real consequence there. So unless we know the background or the play style of a player from playing with them before, then we have to communicate this with people to make sure that it's clear that this game is going to have consequences. And then if we're open that everyone's actions are going to have ramifications, then it's not a surprise when things that they do come back around. It's clear then that it's a consequence. It's not a punishment. It's not going to feel as much like they're being punished for making a quote-unquote wrong choice, because they're expecting things to happen as a result of their actions. They're expecting consequences, and so it doesn't feel like a punishment. The second thing to think about is to remember that it's their story too. We don't use consequences to get them back on the story path that we wanted them to be. If we do that, if we feel that they're going too far off the rails and we just start giving them consequence after consequence just to get them back where we want, then it may very well feel like we're punishing them for their actions. We may have wanted to tell a story of the players cooperating with this troll to get through an obstacle, but then they just killed it. Of course, we have often far more grand plans than that, which get derailed. And of course, sometimes we have fun plans and the players go in a different direction. But it's a collaborative story. It's their story too. They are responding in the way that their characters would to the scenario that we set. We don't get to dictate their every action. Of course, there are overarching, large, campaign arc style plot points which we want to push through and make sure that the players realize that they're there, but there's ways of hitting them over the head with the path to go down without punishing them for the decisions that they've made. So if the party takes an unexpected action, even an action that we wish they hadn't, we can't punish them for that. We can't give them consequences for that because it will feel like a punishment. Now, there are, of course, things that happen in-game which need to be addressed. If, for instance, a party or a party member makes a decision that's unaligned with the values of the play group, like if you're in the middle of a situation and a decision that the player makes is sending the party down a path that makes some of the other party members uncomfortable, that's something which absolutely should be discussed outside of the game. The game should stop and we should discuss this and retcon what we need to and make sure that everyone's comfortable and that everything that's happened is aligned with things which make everyone comfortable. There's things like that which have to happen. But even that is gentle communication. That is standing up for what is right. That is not punishing in-game. That is not having a party member getting a disease because they made a decision, so now all their attacks are at disadvantage. That's not the same thing. What I'm talking about here is just about the small decisions that are made every session, which may not go the way that we want them to go. And we have to understand that we don't get to dictate their every action. It is a collaborative story. It is their story too. The third thing that we should think about is we should watch our tone and our body language. And sometimes this is difficult to help. We can make it a bit obvious if the players do something that we don't like. If we had a massive encounter plan and the players just go the different way, it can be annoying, especially if we've put a lot of work into something. We want to be able to share that work. We want to have that work come to fruition, and then sometimes we just don't get to do it. The problem then occurs is in those situations, if our tone and our body language drastically changes and it becomes very obvious that we're annoyed and frustrated, then whenever the consequences for that decision occur, it will feel more like punishment because our attitude is not in the exact right place. The party is hearing that the result of their action is coming back to bite them from you in a rather PO'd tone of voice, and it's going to come across much more like a punishment when in reality it may just be a very sensible consequence because of what they did. So if we're frustrated in the moment, I think we need to normalize the ability to pause the game for a few minutes to be able to actually reset. And of course, there's some understanding and some patience that the players can show for the DM as well here. And this is made even easier if we've communicated well up front. If we as DMs are abiding by the first things that we've listed, if we've talked to our players up front, and if we're always remembering that it's their story too, then hopefully there's some trust that's developed in your playgroup, and your playgroup will understand that even if you're frustrated, what you're doing is a consequence. It's not a punishment. The last thing we want to do as DMs is to make our players feel bad for doing something that their character would do in the moment. We want to encourage that, not hinder that. Of course, everybody gets frustrated, and it's not wrong to get frustrated. And if we need to even take a few minutes, we should do that. Thinking about how we handle our tone and our body language can help our players not feel punished, but just feel that they're having consequences. The fourth and final thing that I wanted to mention to think about is to keep the consequences clearly in character. And what I mean by that is to keep the consequences in the narrative, in the story. Don't say that there's consequences out of character to them. And I'm not talking about going outside of the game, like we mentioned earlier about refusing to pay for snacks. That's, again, beyond the pale and not what we're talking about. But if I just throw up my hands after a decision that they've made and say, well, now there's going to be a lot more guard activity, then it's going to feel a little bit worse. I've told them that there's going to be a consequence out of character, instead of just telling them as they keep going on that they start seeing a little bit more guard activity. One of those will feel much more like a punishment than the other. Ultimately, all of these things, again, are just things to think about as we're trying to be able to tell the best story that we can. We want to make sure that that line of communication feels open, that our players always feel accepted, and that we're always showing care to one another. That's how we'll get the best stories and the best times and the best fun around the table. So let's be sure to keep these things in mind, to think about how to be best open with our players, to think about how to best remember that it's their story too, to think about how we watch our tone and body language best, and how to keep the consequences clearly in character. I think by just being aware of the difference between consequences and punishment itself is something that will help us in building a really positive DM-player relationship that will help us tell great stories. But what do you think? We'd love to hear from you and experiences that you've had in this arena, and any other tips that you would have for just making sure that there are consequences for their actions, not that they're being punished. Contact us on social media. We'd love to hear your thoughts. But for now, it's about time for us to head out into the wilds and look at a carrion crawler. Right, we're out here in the wilds. Today's monster, the carrion crawler. And sometimes the word monster is just kind of the term that we throw around. This thing is a monster. Quite literally a large monstrosity. The carrion crawler is a giant maggot-looking thing with giant rows of teeth and face tentacles and just incredibly gross looking. And their habits are just as gross. They basically go around trying to feed on carrion. They're giant maggot vultures, so to speak. Because of this, they are very likely to just live and be very territorial, by the way. They will chase down any creature that trespasses on their territory or disturbs them while they're eating. They prefer to hang out in areas where there's lots of death, lots of stuff for them to feed on. They aren't fast, though, a 30-foot climb speed and a 30-foot walking speed, so they tend to prefer areas where other carrion feeders don't have as much chance to move around. So the Monster Manual mentions things like caves, sewers, dungeons, and forested marshes as their favored places to go. But they'll just hang out on a battlefield or something sometimes too. The reason I really like these things, though, is that I love loosely scheduled combat encounters. That's just something I like to have in my games. I like having combat encounters which I know are going to happen, but the timing and location of which entirely depends on the actions of the party. Something like there's something that's going to happen in the dungeon, but depending on how long the party takes to progress through the various rooms, it could happen in any of the different rooms. If they choose to take a long rest here now, then it's going to happen a lot earlier in the dungeon. For the carrion crawler, I think this works great in the stalking category, because it is a patient hunter. Just like vultures that seem to be able to sense the imminent demise of a creature, these monstrosities will actually follow a light source for hours, hoping that they'll smell the scent of blood. So when going through a dungeon or something like that, the party, if they've got a light for them and they happen to walk through the carrion crawler territory as it's patrolling around, then it could just follow them for a while until they happen to come across another creature and then maybe fight it, and then the carrion crawler shows up. Or maybe they choose not to fight the other creatures that they come across, and the carrion crawler eventually gets fed up and sets an ambush for them. Because they'll do that too. They'll sit around blind corners and just wait for the potential food to come to them. So I think they work great as this loosely scheduled encounter where you can just have a carrion crawler following the party, and depending on their actions, that changes what the carrion crawler does. Heck, maybe they kill enough things and leave enough things in their wake that carrion crawler decides not to even bother them. But there are other ways that these creepy monstrosities can be used too. We mentioned how they ambush around corners. Well, they also climb on the ceiling. That's how they move around as they're trying to hunt or prowl or stalk. They're just crawling around on top of the ceiling of whatever cave they happen to be in. So they're great for ambushes. They also are just concerned with food. They're not concerned with wiping out the party. They have a tentacle attack, which is a +8 to hit with a reach of 10 feet, and it deals 1d4 plus 2 poison damage, but the main thing is that the target has to succeed on a DC 13 con save or be poisoned for 1 minute, and until that effect ends, the target is paralyzed. And while it can repeat the saving throw at the end of each of its turns, that paralyzation effect is pretty strong. And what the carrion crawler does is once the victim is paralyzed, it wraps it up in its tentacles and it just kind of drags it away. It takes it to where it can kill that creature safely. Talk about an interesting dynamic for a party. The carrion crawler ambushes them, paralyzes one of them, and just pieces out. And now they've got to chase down this carrion crawler before it kills and eats their friend. As written, it's not incredibly strong. It's only a CR2. But it's something that, by beefing up the hit points and the damage, could be scaled pretty well with relation to the party. It does have that spider climb ability where it can just climb on ceilings or anything without needing to make an ability check. It has that tentacle attack and a bite attack, which deals 2d4 plus 2 piercing damage on a hit. And it can make 2 attacks, a tentacle and a bite, each round. So all that can be pretty easily scaled up, which all of this together I think makes the carrion crawler a very interesting creature and a really cool one to use. It's just incredibly gross and creepy to think about being chased by a giant maggot monster. So be sure to check them out and give them a think next time you're running through a cave or a dungeon or a swamp or something. That might be something you want to throw at your party. But I think that's all the time we have out here in the wilds today. Let's head over to the tavern and get some refreshment. All right, we're out here in the tavern. Today's plot hook: what would you do if a creature needed something strange? Lots of quests have to do with a large, powerful creature giving the party a task, either by being the quest giver themselves or being kind of the last challenge in order to get an item to finish their quest. Like the party has to go get this chalice and they have to answer the Sphinx's riddle before they can finish their quest. Creatures often used in this veins are things like sphinxes or dragons or the like. You want something that's very powerful. That this is best used whenever you're talking about a creature which is much more powerful than the party. You want it clear that the party cannot actually defeat this in combat. It is something which the party has to complete whatever challenge or whatever thing that they need in order to accomplish their goal. But what if the quest is something off the wall? What if it needed something strange? What if the Sphinx didn't have a riddle? What if the dragon didn't want you to prove your strength? What if the Naga didn't want information it didn't know? What if instead the Sphinx wanted a mane trim? What if the dragon wanted a lullaby? What if the Naga wanted their lair swept? There's endless examples and endless ways you could take this, but this concept is incredibly interesting to me. It's obviously completely subversive. It's off the wall. They're expecting something amazing and just powerful that they're going to have to do. They're going to have to show their strength or show their wits, and they get something strange and simple instead. It's so subversive, in fact, that I think a lot of parties are going to doubt the legitimacy of the request. It'll create a lot of interesting inter-party roleplay as the characters try to figure out what's going on, and then also interesting roleplay between the party and the powerful creature. Why do you want us to do this? What's so important about this? Are you sure this is all you want? I think the party could go down some really interesting lines of roleplay given this kind of subversive situation. There's so much potential here. But I think for now, that's about all the time we have on this week's episode of Plot Hooks. Be sure to check out Disaster Hamsters, follow us on social media, check out our Patreon, and as always, thanks so much for listening from all of us here at the Plot Hooks team. I'm Samuel, and thanks from Becca and Izzy, and of course, podcast pupper Ellie. We will see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.